My name is Aubrey Dawson. I'm 29, and I used to think the worst thing my family ever did to me was pretend I didn't matter. But that was before this morning, before I found myself standing in the shadowed corner of a hospital parking garage, cold concrete underfoot, the stink of oil and wet pavement thick in the air, watching my father deliver a sentence that would fracture everything. He didn't yell, he didn't accuse, he just looked at me, calm, detached, and said, "You should have never been born." No heat, no hesitation, just fact, handed down like a line from a ledger he'd long since balanced. And I stood there, blinking, not crying, not breaking, because I already knew, deep down, that this wasn't the first time he'd thought it. It was just the first time he said it out loud. "You didn't mean that," I said, not because I believed it, because I needed to hear him deny it, just once. But he didn't. He shrugged. "You weren't part of the plan, Aubrey. You were the solution." That one hit harder, like an aftershock. I didn't respond. I didn't argue. There was no point anymore. Behind him, through the glass-paneled stairwell, I could see the hospital tower rise like a sterile monolith. Somewhere in there, my sister Claire was being treated like a fragile miracle while I, her insurance policy, stood in a parking garage being told I was a clerical error with a pulse. I stepped sideways, careful not to brush against him. Not out of fear, out of instinct, like touching him might make it realer. And as I walked away, I didn't feel rage, not yet. I felt something colder, cleaner, clarity. Because in that moment, I stopped hoping for warmth from people who only saw me as useful, and I knew something with absolute certainty. I was done being the afterthought. By the time I made it down to the hospital lobby, I thought maybe the worst was behind me. I'd had the garage confrontation. I'd had the line from my father that still echoed in the hollows of my chest. I thought maybe I'd earned a moment of peace. I was wrong. I barely stepped off the elevator before I heard heels on tile, sharp, angry. "Aubrey!" My mother's voice sliced through the soft murmur of receptionists, paging calls and rolling carts. She came at me like a storm, blonde hair frizzed from the humidity, eyes wild, cheeks flushed. In her hands, a manila folder I recognized instantly. "Do you think you can just walk away while your sister's dying?" she hissed. "Is that what we're doing now? Playing the victim while Claire fights for her life?" The folder shook in her grip. I could see my name on the label, my medical file. "Mom, not here," I said, low. But she wasn't listening. She never had. With a violent rip, she tore it open, sheets flying like broken wings across the lobby floor. Blood panels, liver function charts, the donor compatibility report, pages with my name, my body, my story, scattered at strangers' feet. The entire lobby seemed to pause. A nurse near the vending machine froze, hand hovering over a Coke. A man on his phone stopped mid-sentence. "You're letting her die, Aubrey!" Mom shouted. "You're standing here doing nothing while your sister's hanging by a thread." She was crying now, not with sorrow, but fury. Her voice cracking, eyes gleaming with something closer to rage than grief. I bent down, slowly, picking up one of the forms. I didn't do it out of guilt. I did it because it was mine. Because no one else was going to protect it. "You didn't raise me to be this cold," she spat through clenched teeth. "You should be ashamed." I stood, met her gaze full on. My voice didn't shake. "You didn't raise me, Mom. You trained me. There's a difference." She blinked, caught off guard, just long enough for silence to slip between us. And then she screamed, "You ungrateful girl! We gave you everything!" I didn't flinch, didn't yell back, just stood there while every pair of eyes in the lobby burned into me like accusation. But I knew what this was. It wasn't about Claire. It wasn't about love. This was control dressed up in sacrifice, and I wasn't going to wear it anymore. I didn't mean to stop in front of her room. But my feet betrayed me, carrying me halfway down the oncology wing until I found myself staring through the reinforced glass of room 614. There she was, Claire. She looked smaller than I remembered, draped in sterile white, body swallowed by hospital sheets, IV poles like cold metal trees on either side. The fluorescent lights didn't do her any favors. Cheekbones sharper, skin pale, lips cracked, but somehow, she still made it look like a stage. Her head turned slowly, like she knew I'd be watching. Maybe she always knew. And then came the look. That look. The same one she used to give me across the dinner table when I dared to speak during one of her stories. The one she gave in high school when I made the swim team after she got cut from varsity cheer. It said everything, without a word. I'm still the center. You're still the orbit. Her lips didn't move, but the corners curled. Just barely. Not a smile. A smirk. Like a quiet, satisfied breath after watching a building burn. I stood there, clutching the crumpled medical forms I'd just picked up off the lobby floor, and something cold began to pool beneath my ribs. Not sadness, not grief. Recognition. She wasn't surprised by Mom's outburst. She wasn't concerned about my humiliation. She expected it, because this was the rhythm we were born into. Claire shines. I shrink. Claire commands. I comply. Only this time, something was different. I didn't feel small, I felt furious. I knelt and picked up a loose page near the hallway baseboard, just to do something with my hands. Not because I owed anyone anything, but because the paper still mattered. It was mine, and I was done letting them scatter pieces of me like I was nothing. Claire tilted her head, watching. Regal, detached, like I was an exhibit behind glass. I didn't wave, didn't nod. I turned and walked away. Let her smirk. Let her think the game was still on. She had no idea what was coming. I didn't make it far from Claire's room before I heard the tap of Mom's heels again. Sharp, relentless, like she was chasing more than just my footsteps. I was halfway down the corridor, pretending not to notice the nurses whispering behind their station, when she caught up. She didn't yell this time. She lowered her voice like that made it holy. You need to stop this little performance, Aubrey. I turned to face her. Her mascara had smudged just slightly beneath her right eye. Her blouse was wrinkled near the collarbone. Even her rage looked curated. You think you're some kind of victim? She hissed. You're not. You're selfish, cold. Claire's body is shutting down upstairs, and you're down here picking up paper like that's more important than her life? I should have walked away. Should have kept quiet, but I'd been quiet long enough. I looked her dead in the eye. You didn't raise me, Mom, I said, voice steady. You positioned me. She blinked, just once, a tiny hitch in the performance. We gave you a home, she said. We gave you opportunities. No, I cut in. You gave me obligations dressed as gifts. You gave me conditional love and called it sacrifice. Her face went still. Not soft, just frozen. Then, slowly, she leaned closer. You're going to regret the things you're saying. You're not thinking clearly right now. And that's when I smiled, not with joy, with clarity. I've never seen clearer in my life. A sharp inhale. Her nails dug into the palm of her hand, and I stepped around her. No drama, no flinch, just the sound of her breathing hard behind me as I walked away, like she was the one unraveling now. For the first time, I wasn't playing my part, and it rattled her. Good. I walked away from her like I'd rehearsed it. No shouting, no slamming doors. Just the sound of my boots on tile and the distant beeping of machines that didn't care whose world had just cracked open. The corridor wasn't empty. That was the worst part. 2 nurses by the medicine fridge suddenly found their shoes fascinating. A volunteer adjusted the flower vase at the check-in desk for the 3rd time in 30 seconds. A woman holding a toddler shifted to block the child's view. But no one spoke. No one looked at me. And somehow that silence was louder than anything my mother had screamed. I paused near the window, fingers still gripping the edges of the crumpled file, knuckles white. They had all seen what just happened. Seen me get eviscerated in public, accused, shamed, humiliated. And still, not a single person moved. Not one voice rose. Not one hand reached out. It was like the air around me had turned to glass. Everyone could see in, but no one dared to knock. For a second, I actually wondered if I had overreacted, if maybe I was the problem. That's the trick silence plays. It makes you think you deserve it. I started walking again, each step heavier than the last, until I reached the end of the corridor where the elevator sat glowing. Still, ready, oblivious. I pressed the button, waited, watched my reflection in the doors as they slid open. Hair messy, eyes rimmed in red, shoulders square. But I didn't look broken. I looked awake. The kind of awake that only comes after too many years of making yourself small enough to fit into spaces never meant for you. As the doors closed behind me, I realized something I hadn't wanted to admit. They didn't just let it happen. They counted on me being too ashamed to fight back. And until today, they were right. I didn't go far. There was a narrow hallway just off the waiting area near the consultation rooms. Quiet, half forgotten, with 2 vinyl chairs and a vending machine that looked older than I was. I sank into the one closest to the wall, still gripping the mangled file like it might dissolve if I let go. I tried to breathe, but the air felt stale. My mother's voice was still echoing in my head, my father's indifference, Claire's smirk through the glass, and for a moment it all blurred together. Every conversation, every command masked as concern, every guilt-laced gesture masquerading as love. And then it hit me. They weren't trying to save Claire. They were trying to use me to prove they still could. It wasn't about love. Not even close. It was about leverage. About keeping me on the hook. About reminding me I was only as valuable as what I could give. I pulled out my phone, not even sure what I was looking for, and opened the Notes app. My fingers moved faster than my thoughts, typing before I had time to second-guess. You cannot donate what you don't have. You cannot love where you're not allowed to exist. And you cannot stay where you were never really invited. I stared at those words like they belonged to someone braver than me. Then I hit save, because something inside me had shifted, quietly, like the click of a door unlocking. I used to think staying silent was the safest thing I could do. Now I realized it had been my biggest mistake. Their control didn't come from yelling or threats. It came from convincing me I had no right to say no. But now I knew better, and that made me dangerous. I don't know what made me think of it right then. Maybe it was the weight of that file still in my lap. Maybe it was the silence after the realization that I'd been nothing more than a pawn. Or maybe I was just finally ready to see the thing I'd been too afraid to look at. I unlocked my phone, thumb hovering for a second, then tapped open the email app. Not the inbox, the archive, buried beneath appointment reminders and birthday coupons and old newsletters I never unsubscribed from. Search, National Donor Match Program. There it was, time-stamped October 24th, 6 months ago. I remembered the day I took that test. No one had asked me to. Claire wasn't even in critical condition yet. But I did it anyway, because some small, foolish part of me still believed that if I stepped up early, maybe, just maybe, they'd finally see me as something more than a safety net. I tapped the email open. Dear Ms. Dawson, thank you for your participation. Based on genetic and immunologic analysis, there is no biological compatibility between you and the referenced patient. You are not a match, partial, marginal, or otherwise. No compatibility, no chance, no role to play, and yet for 6 months I'd been treated like a refusal, like a failure, like someone choosing not to help when the truth was I never could have helped to begin with. They knew, or they could have. The email had my name, my date of birth, my blood type, all neatly listed like a neon sign. I stared at the bolded phrase, "Not a match," until my vision blurred. It wasn't sadness I felt. It was clarity again, sharpened, cold, necessary. They didn't just expect me to save her. They expected me not to ask questions. I didn't hesitate this time, not out of anger, not even out of spite, out of something sharper, precision. I tapped the forward icon at the top of the email, watching the little cursor blink back at me like it was asking, "Are you sure?" Yes. To Dr. Marcus Klein. CC, Rachel Kim, Civil Counsel. I kept the subject line clinical, reconfirming donor screening, for medical record accuracy and in the body. Just a few lines, nothing emotional, no story, just fact. Dr. Klein, please find attached the results from the national screening conducted in October. For transparency, I've copied my legal counsel on this exchange. Aubrey Dawson. I attached the PDF, checked it twice, and hit send. The moment the email left my phone, I felt it. A shift, like air moving before a storm. It wasn't dramatic, there was no music swelling in the background, but it was the first time I'd acted on my terms. No approval, no permission. Just power. Quiet, deliberate. Mine. I leaned back in the stiff hospital chair and stared at the overhead light flickering slightly in its casing. Everything around me looked the same. White walls, linoleum floors, the faint hum of life continuing on in rooms around me. But something had changed. Me. My hands resting in my lap weren't trembling. My breath was steady. Because now the lie wasn't just mine to carry. It was in the hands of someone who'd be legally required to see it. My phone buzzed with a delivery confirmation. I smiled without meaning to. This wasn't a breakdown. It was a record. I didn't even notice him at first. I was walking past the family consult rooms, eyes still on my phone, rereading the email I'd just sent like it was a shield. Proof that I wasn't crazy or cruel or whatever label they'd planned to stick on me next. And then I looked up. He was leaning against the wall just a few feet from Claire's room, hands in his coat pockets, head tilted like he'd been waiting for me, not out of concern. Out of routine, like I was a meeting slot he needed to check off. Greg Dawson, my father. By blood only. He didn't say my name. Of course not. He never did. He looked at me the way you look at a car that stopped working before warranty expired, mildly inconvenient, mostly replaceable. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he said. No anger, no volume. Just that familiar, flat detachment that used to make me question if I was imagining things. I didn't answer. He stepped closer, slow, deliberate, like he was about to offer life advice. "You were never supposed to be here," he said. "You were a contingency, nothing more." And then, almost gently, "You were just a placeholder." He might as well have reached into my chest and pressed down, hard, not because it hurt, but because it was confirmation. The missing piece. The final line in the script I was never allowed to revise. I held his gaze for a beat too long, not blinking, not breathing. Then I stepped to the side, just enough to pass him without brushing his arm. It felt like crossing some invisible border. "No," I said quietly, just loud enough for him to hear. "I was a placeholder. Past tense. You don't get to use me anymore." And I kept walking. Not faster, not trembling, just done. The elevator doors closed behind me with a soft hiss, sealing me inside a mirrored box that smelled faintly of antiseptic and something metallic, maybe regret. It was just me and my reflection. I looked steady. Not good, not composed, but upright, intact, which felt like a miracle considering the last 2 hours. I watched the red LED panel count its way down to the ground floor, floor 6, 5, 4. I could still hear my father's voice in the back of my skull. "You were just a placeholder." That kind of sentence doesn't leave bruises, it leaves echoes. When the elevator hit floor 3, I pulled out my phone, not to call anyone, not to check email, just to record it. The truth. While it was still sharp and alive and mine. I opened the Notes app and typed 3 lines, one at a time. No backspacing, no second guessing. Tested October 19th. Results received October 24th. Not a match. 3 timestamps. 3 receipts. 3 reasons I wasn't the villain they needed me to be. I stared at the blinking cursor for a moment. Then, on instinct, I added something else. You cannot donate what you don't have. You cannot love where you're not allowed to exist. And you cannot stay where you were never really invited. It didn't feel like a diary entry. It felt like a eulogy. Not for Claire, not for my parents, for the version of me that spent her life apologizing for simply existing. The elevator chimed softly as it hit the lobby. I hit save. And for the first time that day, I realized my hands weren't shaking. Because I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was documenting. I had barely stepped outside. The sun had pushed through the clouds over Seattle, turning the hospital courtyard into a patch of gold that felt almost mocking. I stood by the edge of the drop-off zone, watching people live their lives. A dad buckling his toddler into a car seat, a nurse sipping coffee through a lipstick-stained straw. Everyone moved forward, effortless, and then my phone buzzed. I looked down. Dr. Marcus Klein. "Hi, Ms. Dawson. Can you return to my office today? We need to clarify an inconsistency in your file. That was it? Polite? Clean? Vague enough to pass for nothing. But I knew better. There's a certain type of phrasing professionals use when something doesn't add up, and they're hoping you'll walk in quietly without an attorney. My stomach turned. Not fear, not dread, more like instinct. I didn't respond right away, just stared at the message, thumb hovering, and then I typed, "On my way." No emojis, no exclamation marks, just quiet readiness. I slid the phone into my coat pocket and turned back toward the main entrance, footsteps steadier than they should have been. Inside, the air smelled like lemon cleaner and linoleum. The automatic doors hissed closed behind me, like the start of a chapter I didn't ask to write. Something was coming. I could feel it in the base of my spine, the way animals sense storms before clouds form. This wasn't about donor data. This wasn't about my match status. This was about something deeper, something that had been wrong for a very long time and was just now beginning to leak through the seams. The lights in Dr. Klein's office were brighter than I remembered, clinical and unforgiving, like they'd been turned up just for this conversation. He stood when I walked in, but there was no small talk this time. No, "How are you holding up?" No attempt to ease the tension, just a nod toward the chair across from his desk. I sat. He didn't. There was a folder open in front of him, plain, manila, like every other file in this building, but I could tell by the way he looked at it that this one was different. "Aubrey," he said carefully, folding his hands. "Before we go further, I need to confirm something with you." I didn't move. "Okay. When was your last genetic screening?" I blinked. "October. The donor test. You have the results." He nodded once, then turned his monitor toward me. The screen lit up with 2 side-by-side charts, color-coded, labeled with names I recognized. Mine, Claire's. But something was wrong. Even I could see it. The 2 charts didn't overlap. Not at all. He tapped the screen with the cap of his pen. "That's the issue. There should be significant genetic alignment between siblings. There isn't. We ran it twice." I stared at the display, each non-matching marker like a blow to the ribs. Then I said it, quietly, because I needed to hear it out loud. "I'm not biologically related." Dr. Klein didn't flinch. "No." The word landed like a dropped stone in a still lake, not a wave, a weight, and in that stillness, every strange moment of my life reshaped itself. Every cold glance, every "we didn't have to keep you," every holiday photo where I stood a step too far from the rest. I had always known something was off. I just didn't know the math could prove it. They hadn't raised me out of love. They had selected me out of need, and now that need was over. I left Dr. Klein's office on autopilot. My legs carried me back to the same hallway where I'd once sat wondering how things had gone so wrong. But this time, I knew. The truth didn't hit me like a crash. It crept in, slow, steady, undeniable. And with it came the memories. Not the obvious ones, not birthdays or Christmas mornings, the small ones. The ones I'd filed away as quirks or bad timing, or me just being too sensitive. I remembered the time in 2nd grade when we had to build family trees for a school project. Claire's branches were full, grandparents, great-aunts, cousins in Nebraska I'd never met. Mine was thinner. When I asked Mom why I didn't have baby photos before age 3, she said, "We didn't own a camera back then." But there were stacks of Claire's ultrasound pictures taped to the fridge. I remembered how Dad used to introduce me to coworkers. "This is Aubrey," he'd say. Never my daughter, just a name. Like I was an intern tagging along. There was that Thanksgiving when Aunt Melissa got drunk and muttered, "You know, we didn't have to take her in." I'd laughed, awkward and confused, but no one corrected her. No one even looked surprised. And then there were the little ways Claire reminded me I didn't quite fit. "You don't look like the rest of us. No one in our family's that stubborn. You should be grateful. You hit the lottery." God, I'd swallowed that line for years, believing maybe I had gotten lucky, maybe love was always supposed to feel earned. But now, sitting there with my arms wrapped tight around my ribs, I knew better. This wasn't bad memory or family dysfunction. This was design. They didn't forget to include me. They never meant to. I didn't cry, not when I left Dr. Klein's office, not when the glass doors hissed open and swallowed me into the fluorescent hallway again. I didn't fall apart. I walked. Down the corridor, past the nurse's station, past room 614 where Claire lay oblivious in her curated martyrdom. I turned left at the family consult suite and kept moving until I saw the small sign I hadn't noticed before. Medical Records Department. I pushed the door open. Cool air, the quiet buzz of a printer, a receptionist with soft eyes and a clipped name badge that read Melinda. She looked up and smiled politely. "Can I help you?" I set my bag on the counter with care, like I was placing down evidence. "Yes, I need copies of every medical record tied to my name. All screenings, genetic tests, transplant evaluations, everything in the last 12 months. Her hands hovered over the keyboard. "Of course. Are you requesting these for personal review or legal?" "Both," I said flatly. She blinked. "Okay, we'll just need you to fill out this release form. I also need them notarized, stamped, dated, sealed. I want every page certified, and I'd like it ready for legal review." There was a pause. Not resistance, just recognition. Something in my voice must have told her this wasn't routine. She nodded. "We can do that. It'll take a few hours. I'll wait." I sat down in the farthest corner of the waiting area, back straight, heart steady. This wasn't just about having the truth anymore. It was about owning it. On paper, in ink, with names and timestamps that couldn't be bent or buried. Because the next time someone questioned what happened here, I wouldn't raise my voice. I'd just hold up a folder. I was halfway through my second coffee when the screen lit up. Mom. Mobile. I stared at it like it was a name I didn't recognize. Not Mom. Not really. Just a woman who once told a sobbing 7-year-old to stop crying before he embarrassed the family in church. I let it ring. Not because I was angry. I'd passed angry hours ago, somewhere between the signed release forms and the quiet click of the hospital copier. I was just done. The phone kept buzzing. I watched the screen go dark, then light up again. Voicemail. Then it rang a second time. She never called twice. Not unless something was broken, not unless she needed something. But I didn't move. I leaned back into the vinyl booth of the diner, stirred my coffee, and kept my eyes on the window. Outside, a father knelt to tie his daughter's sneaker. She laughed, pointing at the ice cream melting down her cone. He wiped her chin with his sleeve. It didn't make me sad. Not anymore. It just made me quiet. The phone rang a third time. I silenced it. There was a time I would have scrambled for it, explained myself, apologized for the tone in my voice, the firmness in my spine. But today, silence was my reply. That silence said, "I heard everything you didn't say when you ripped those forms in half. I saw everything in your eyes when Claire collapsed and you looked right past me. I remember everything." A minute later, a text came through. Just one line. "Can we talk?" I placed the phone face down. No reply. And for the first time in years, the silence didn't ache. It felt like air. There's a strange kind of stillness that clings to hospital hallways after midnight, not the silence of peace, the silence of waiting, of knowing something's either already broken or about to be. I found myself in that corner again. Same chipped wall, same burnt-out ceiling light, same vending machine humming like it was the only thing still breathing. I slid down the wall and hugged my knees. Not crying, not this time. Just listening. For years, I'd lived with this tightness in my chest, like I was constantly holding my breath. One wrong move, one wrong word, and I'd be too much again. Too loud, too sensitive, too different. So I got smaller, quieter, easier to ignore. But tonight, after everything, I realized something. This wasn't survival anymore. I didn't need to keep shrinking to fit a place I never chose. I didn't need their twisted definitions of love that felt more like a leash than a lifeline. I didn't need to fight for a seat at a table where I was always the afterthought. A nurse passed by and gave me a soft smile. She didn't know who I was, didn't know the mess I came from. But she looked at me like I mattered, like I existed, and that That was enough to make something crack open inside me. I pulled out my phone and opened the Notes app, typed out just 3 lines. This is not survival anymore. This is clarity. And I'm not going back. I stared at those words for a long while, then hit save. Somewhere down the hall, a monitor beeped. But for the first time in years, the rhythm I was listening to was my own. The room smelled like overbrewed coffee and nervous energy, bright lights, tense whispers, a dozen eyes pretending not to stare as I walked past them toward the podium. I had never stood behind a microphone before. I had never needed to. I was the background noise in someone else's story, the daughter they mentioned when it was convenient, the afterthought in footnotes. But this time, I wasn't here to be quiet. Rachel gave me a reassuring nod from the front row, her legal pad open, her presence grounding. Claire sat at the end of the table, face frozen in that tight PR smile she wore like armor. She didn't expect me to show up. Not after what she and my father had done, not after the years they spent building their clean little narrative, the dutiful daughter, the medical legacy, the family sacrifice. But lies have short legs, and today they couldn't run far enough. I took a breath. Steady. Firm. Before we begin, I said, voice clearer than even I expected, I'd like to read a short statement. The room went still. For years, I let other people speak on my behalf. I let them define who I was, what I owed, and where I belonged. But silence doesn't protect truth. It only buries it. I paused, meeting Claire's eyes. For the first time, I saw fear flicker behind her perfect composure. I was never a match for my father, not medically, and yet the lie went on, because image was worth more than integrity, because control was disguised as concern. But I'm done carrying someone else's guilt. A few gasps. Someone's pen stopped scribbling. I continued, I'm not here to destroy anyone. I'm here to reclaim myself. My name is Aubrey Dawson, and this... I tapped my chest lightly. This is where my story begins. Not in their shadows, not under their rules, but right here, in my own words. Silence again, but not the kind that erases you. This time, it felt like space being made, for me. The hotel room was quiet, except for the ticking of the wall clock and the faint rustle of papers in my hand. I had been rewriting this letter for days, on paper, in my head, in the breath I held whenever someone asked about my family. But this version would be final. No edits, no filters, just truth. I sat down at the edge of the bed, my phone already recording. No cameras, no audience, just me and her. Claire, I began, voice soft but unwavering. You once told me that family was sacrifice, that love looked like compliance, that obedience was safety. I believed you, for years. My fingers curled around the letter. You told me I was chosen, special, saved for something bigger. And maybe I was, just not by you. I let out a slow breath, eyes stinging. Here's what I know now. I was brought into your life not because of love, but because of what I could give, what I could be molded into. And when I stopped fitting that shape, you erased me. The words came easier now, like they'd been waiting. You needed me to be silent, to be small, but I'm not either of those things anymore. I stood up, walking to the window. The city below moved on, uncaring and loud, and for once, I felt strangely aligned with it. So I'm giving you this. Not as a plea, not as a farewell, but as clarity. I owe you nothing, not my pain, not my silence, not my body. I paused, then smiled faintly. And just so we're clear, in case you ever feel tempted to rewrite my ending like you rewrote my beginning, let me leave you with one final truth. I looked directly into the camera lens, breath steady. My name is Aubrey Dawson, and I don't belong to you anymore. I stopped the recording. Then, for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I needed to hit delete. The room was silent. Not the respectful kind, more like the breath-holding kind. I stood by the projector, watching the first slide appear on the screen behind me. Medical records, dates, numbers, signatures. Let's begin, I said, my voice echoing a little too loudly at first. These are the original compatibility reports from North Shore Medical Center. The tests were conducted when Dr. Dawson was first diagnosed. I could feel Claire's stare burning holes into the side of my face. But I didn't turn. Slide 2. This one's from 3 years ago. A second test, done quietly without my consent. My name appears in the donor profile, but the blood type doesn't match. Never did. Gasps rippled across the room. I moved forward, switching slides. And here, this is a signed statement from the lead technician who ran the DNA cross-match. The results were flagged as non-viable donor, but that never made it to the official report. I turned then, looked directly at my father. His jaw was clenched, hands gripping the arms of his seat like they might keep him grounded. I was never a match, I said, eyes locked on his. You knew. Claire knew. But you kept up the lie because it made for a better story. Because a devoted daughter sells better than a discarded one. A few reporters were already flipping through the packets Rachel had handed out. The silence was crumbling, replaced by the low hum of murmuring and disbelief. I walked to the center of the room. This isn't vengeance, I said. It's correction. For every time I was told to stay silent. For every time you called my anger hysteria. For every whispered lie dressed up as love. I paused. Let it all settle. You don't get to rewrite my history anymore. I stepped back, leaving the final slide up, a time-stamped email thread with the subject line, "Patient incompatible, ethics concern raised." The truth was no longer a secret, it was public record, and I had been the one to release it. I stayed at the podium a moment longer than planned, not to savor it, just to breathe. The questions from the press were already rolling in like waves, crashing over one another. Some were kind, some weren't. Ms. Dawson, what do you hope to gain from all this? That one stopped me, not because I didn't have an answer, because for the first time in my life, I knew it fully. I leaned into the mic, voice steady but not cold. I think people assume this was about revenge, about proving something to my family, but it's not. I glanced toward the back of the room where Claire stood stiff, arms crossed, eyes unreadable. My father sat slumped beside her, no longer looking at me. I didn't come here to hurt anyone. I came to take back the version of myself that was rewritten without my consent. I let that sit, then added quietly, I didn't want revenge. I wanted a voice. Someone in the front row scribbled so fast their pen scratched across the table. I grew up thinking silence meant love, that compliance meant belonging, but silence nearly erased me. So no, this isn't about bitterness, it's about truth. I paused, scanning the faces before me. You can't heal in the dark. You can't rebuild on lies. Then I stepped back, not with fire in my eyes, but with peace, a different kind of power, because standing there, surrounded by cameras, questions, and 100 opinions, I didn't feel small anymore. I felt seen, and that, for me, was more than enough. The silence after my statement was brittle. And then, chaos. A sharp gasp cut through the room, followed by the sound of something heavy hitting the floor. I turned instinctively. My mother, Linda Dawson, lay crumpled near the edge of the press gallery, her body curled unnaturally, her hand clutching at her chest. Gasps rippled across the crowd. Reporters rose from their seats. Some cameras swung away from me. Others didn't. Claire shot up from her seat, panic in her eyes. "Mom! Mom!" she shrieked, bolting toward her. A few medics rushed in, security too. For a moment, everything dissolved into static noise. Chairs scraped, voices overlapped, and still, I stood rooted. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt detached, hollow. My mother, the woman who once warned me not to wear red lipstick to a scholarship interview because it made me look cheap, now lay collapsed beneath the weight of a truth she helped manufacture. A nurse waved frantically, and someone pulled Claire aside. She stumbled, mascara streaked, eyes wild, clutching her phone like a lifeline. "Keep streaming! People need to see she's faking it!" Claire barked into the phone, but her voice cracked, unraveling mid-sentence. The screen in the back corner, a feed of Claire's live stream, sputtered once, then again, and then it was gone, offline. Someone had cut the feed. I don't know if it was a tech staffer, or Rachel, or Karma. "All I know is," Claire screamed, "this isn't over! Do you hear me?" She shrieked at no one in particular, her voice echoing in the mic someone forgot to turn off. But it was over. Or at least, the version of their story they wanted the world to believe. And for the first time, I didn't have to say anything at all. The silence spoke loud enough. I stepped off the stage into a hallway that hummed with urgency. Paramedics wheeling my mother toward the elevators, Claire screaming into her phone, reporters rushing to catch the next angle. But I kept walking, not quickly, not in fear, just forward. Rachel fell into step beside me, her briefcase now open, thick with affidavits, test results, notarized declarations, the truth, bound and backed by law. Her hand grazed my arm lightly. "You did it, Aubrey," she said, her voice steady, firm. "They can't bury it anymore." I didn't answer right away. My heels clicked against the linoleum like punctuation marks to a story they never saw coming. In a way, they didn't just silence me all these years, they underestimated me, treated me like a misplaced chapter in their precious legacy. But today, that chapter turned the whole book upside down. A security guard near the back entrance hesitated when he saw me. "Ms. Dawson, should we—" "No," Rachel interrupted smoothly. "She's not to be stopped. She's finished here." I looked up at the exit. For a moment, I could still hear the muffled chaos behind me. The sound of a family scrambling to erase the evidence, rewrite history, preserve appearances. But the era of appearances was over. From now on, the truth would wear my face. I pushed the door open into the sunlight, not blazing, not dramatic, just clean, bright, honest. Outside, a few journalists turned, cameras already refocused. But I didn't flinch, I didn't duck, I didn't run. Let them see me. Let them know the name Aubrey Dawson wasn't a footnote in someone else's legacy. It was the author's name on the cover. And no one, not Claire, not Linda, not even the bloodline they clung to like armor, had the authority to erase that now. The air outside the building tasted like freedom, cooler than I expected, like it belonged to someone who'd just finished burning her old life to the ground. I walked slowly toward my car, each step lighter than the one before, as if the weight of silence had finally slid off my shoulders. My phone buzzed. "Rachel." "Still standing?" she asked, half joking. "Barely," I smiled, though the truth was, I'd never stood taller. There was a long pause between us, the kind only shared by two women who had just cracked open a decades-old vault of lies and survived what came pouring out. Then I said it, calmly, clearly, with no room for hesitation. "Send the files, Rachel, every last page." "To—" "The press. All of them. National, local, even that indie journalist from Seattle you like. The story doesn't belong to the Dawsons anymore. It belongs to the people. Let them see the kind of truth we've been told to fear." She didn't argue. "It's already prepped," she said. "I'll hit send." My hands tightened slightly around the steering wheel. It wasn't revenge I was chasing anymore. It was justice unchained, messy, inconvenient, undeniable. The kind of truth that lived beyond courtrooms and family names. "They'll come after you," Rachel warned gently. "You know that, right? Claire, Linda, that board." "I know," I whispered, eyes locked on my reflection in the rearview mirror. "But this time they'll be chasing a woman who's no longer afraid of being erased." I ended the call and sat in the silence that followed. Not the heavy kind, the kind that presses on your chest and dares you to breathe, but the kind that clears the air, that makes room for something new, the kind that always comes right before the world listens. It started with a single headline: "Whistleblower exposes decades-long medical ethics scandal tied to Dawson Research Foundation." By the end of the day, it was everywhere. CNN, the New York Times, podcasts, Reddit threads dissecting every document Rachel had leaked. Some called it the most damning betrayal in biotech history. Others called it the tip of an iceberg we've ignored for too long. I sat in my apartment, knees pulled to my chest, watching the news unfold on loop. I wasn't celebrating, I wasn't crying either. I was just still. On screen, a journalist read aloud from one of the documents we had uncovered. Unlicensed stem cell trials conducted on terminal patients, with no signed consent, over 40% of them undocumented in the Foundation's official archive. Then came another headline: Claire Dawson and Dr. Linda Prescott under federal investigation. Claire's face, calm, polished, cold, flashed across the screen. But this time the mask cracked. Her voice from a past interview echoed, "We only operate with the highest integrity." Not anymore. My phone was on fire. Calls from reporters, texts from people I hadn't spoken to in years. Some offered praise, others asked for my protection. But one message stood out, from a woman named Laura in Ohio. "My dad was part of that trial in 2008. They told us he had a shot. He died 6 weeks later. Thank you for telling the truth." I read it 3 times, then whispered to the silence, "You weren't supposed to carry that alone." Suddenly, this wasn't just about me. It never had been. The wave was crashing hard, and this time, it wasn't going to stop at headlines. It was going to change policy, rewrite codes, strip the powerful of their polished lies. And in the middle of it all, I was no longer just a daughter cast aside. I was a voice the world had finally heard. 3 days after the press storm, I stood in the living room of the house I used to call home. Not a single photo of me remained on the walls. Dad sat on the edge of the couch, elbows on his knees, hands locked together. His eyes were bloodshot but dry. Across from him, Claire stared blankly at the fireplace. Dr. Linda Prescott hadn't said a word since I walked in. The TV was muted, the air too thick for sound. The same woman who once gave speeches about the future of ethical science now looked like a shadow draped in designer wool. I broke the silence first. "I'm not here for apologies or explanations." No one interrupted. "I just needed to see it with my own eyes," I added, voice calm. "What silence looks like when it finally runs out of power." Dad opened his mouth, then closed it. Claire didn't blink. I waited for even a flicker of remorse, a crack in their carefully curated indifference. But nothing came. No rage, no denial, no attempt to salvage the facade, just silence. And in that silence, something shattered. But it wasn't me. It was the illusion I'd chased my whole life, that if I worked hard enough, succeeded enough, obeyed enough, they'd finally see me as theirs. "You taught me a lot," I said, turning to leave. "But the biggest lesson was this: not every family is meant to be kept." My hand touched the doorknob. I paused, then looked back one last time. "I used to wonder why you didn't fight for me. Turns out you never even saw me as someone worth fighting for." The door clicked shut behind me. No one followed. No one called after me. And for the first time, that silence didn't sting. It set me free. The sun hadn't fully climbed over the Los Angeles skyline, but the sky was already painted in shades of peach and lavender. I sat barefoot on the balcony, legs tucked under me, hands wrapped around a warm mug of coffee. No noise, no rushing footsteps, no demands echoing down a sterile hallway. Just birdsong, the faint hum of the city, and peace. For the first time, the air felt like mine. I didn't check my phone. I didn't scroll headlines or reread the fallout. I didn't need to. The world could spin without me for a moment. For the first time in 28 years, I wasn't surviving. I was just existing. And somehow, that felt like a revolution. Rachel had texted late the night before. "Media's still on fire, but the truth's out. We did it, Aubrey." I smiled into my cup, letting the warmth of both coffee and vindication seep into me. In the quiet, my thoughts drifted to Grandma May, the woman who taught me how to breathe deep when the air felt tight, who once whispered, "Just because they brought you here doesn't mean they get to define you." She was right. And this morning, On this balcony, I was finally living in a space of my own design. No more white coats trying to own my name, no more boardrooms filled with voices that talked over mine. Just me, my truth, and the sky. My hand reached for a pen. I scribbled something on the corner of an old napkin. Freedom doesn't always roar. Sometimes it sips coffee on a Tuesday morning. I leaned back in the chair, closed my eyes, and let the sunlight kiss my face. And for the first time, I didn't feel like a borrowed daughter or an orphan in a family that never truly claimed me. I just felt whole. My phone buzzed just as I finished folding the last of the donation letters for the medical grant. I glanced at the screen. St. Benedict's General Hospital. I hesitated before answering. It had been weeks since I walked out of that place. Weeks since I stopped letting it define me. "Hello?" I said cautiously. A measured voice responded, Dawson, this is Dr. Ellison from the hematology department. I apologize for calling out of the blue, but something's come up during the audit." My chest tightened. "Go on?" "There's been a review of the stem cell compatibility logs," he continued, "and it appears your file was flagged when we ran compatibility tests for your father. Well, who you believed to be your father, there was no match, not even a partial." I was silent. He continued gently now. "It's unusual for a child and a parent to have zero match, even accounting for medical anomalies. We cross-checked for lab error. There wasn't any." I closed my eyes. The air seemed to shift around me. I wasn't surprised, just confirmed, like a puzzle piece finally snapping into place. "I understand," I whispered. "Thank you for calling." Before he could say anything else, I ended the call. For a moment, I just stood there, phone still in hand, heartbeat thudding in my ears. The truth wasn't sharp anymore. It didn't cut. It just sat there, quiet and solid. I never belonged in that family. Not in blood. Not in bond. And now, not even in biology. I walked over to the window and looked out at the horizon. No tears, no rage, just clarity. They'd built an empire on lies. But I was building truth from the ashes. I turned away from the glass and picked up my pen again. This didn't change anything. It only made everything make sense. The soft ping of a text message broke the quiet in my office, where sunlight filtered through slatted blinds and dust danced midair. I reached for my phone, assuming it was another update from Rachel or one of the media teams handling the fallout. But when I saw the name on the screen, Claire Harmon, I froze. We hadn't spoken since the live stream. My fingers hovered over the screen before tapping to open the message. "I don't expect a reply, just thought you should know." A pause. Another ping. "I overheard your mother once. In the East Corridor. I was 16. She said, 'Let her stay. We don't know when we'll need her.' He said, 'You think she'd ever agree to be a donor if she knew?' She laughed. 'That's why we won't tell her.'" The air rushed out of my lungs. Another ping. "They kept you just in case." I sat back, the phone still glowing in my hand. I remembered every time I had begged to be chosen, to be seen, to be kept, not out of necessity, but love. And now, the ugly irony, I had been kept, like a contingency plan. A living insurance policy. It wasn't that I didn't suspect. Somewhere in the quiet spaces between their glances, in the long silences after my questions, I had felt it. But reading it, stark, typed, undeniable, it hollowed something out of me. My jaw clenched. I didn't cry. I wouldn't. Instead, I stood, walked to the large mirror by the bookshelf and looked at myself. Not with pity, but recognition. They had kept me close out of fear, but I had risen on my own terms. My reflection stared back at me, steady and unflinching. "They'll never get to use me again," I said aloud. And for the first time in my life, I believed it. The judge's voice was calm, but final. "Your request for legal name change is granted. Effective immediately, you are no longer legally tied to the Harmon family name." A silence settled over the small courtroom, the kind of silence that feels like it stretches through time itself. I sat still, hands clasped in my lap. Rachel gave me a soft nudge with her elbow from the seat beside me. "You okay?" she whispered. I nodded, but truthfully the feeling wasn't as triumphant as I'd expected. It wasn't some soaring high. It was quieter, firmer, like stepping into your own shoes after years of wearing someone else's. Growing up, the name Harmon had always been a leash, a label they clung to, so I'd never forget I owed them something. Even after I built my own career, made a name for myself, they'd sneer, "You're a Harmon, don't forget who gave you that name." But Aubrey Dawson? That name was mine. Earned, worn, tested in fire. "Will you be choosing a new last name?" the clerk asked politely as I filled out the final forms. I looked up at her, then down at the pen in my hand. "No," I said. "Dawson stays." The clerk blinked. "You're not legally a Dawson, though." "I know." My voice didn't waver. "But I chose that name when I left home. And everything I built, the research, the partnerships, the advocacy work, it all lives under that name. That identity wasn't handed to me. I claimed it, and I'll keep it." She paused, then offered a small, respectful nod. "Understood." As I walked out of the courthouse, the late morning sun hit my face. A breeze pulled gently at my coat. I turned my phone over in my hand, hesitated, then opened my contacts. I scrolled to Mother, deleted, then to Father, deleted. The past didn't deserve shortcuts in my life anymore. From this point on, I answered only to myself. And her name was Aubrey Dawson. It came on a Tuesday morning. Just a white envelope tucked between bills and flyers, no return address. I almost tossed it, but something made me pause. Inside was a handwritten note, in slightly slanted cursive. "Dear Ms. Dawson, I saw your story. I watched the press conference online, every second of it. I'm only 17, but for the first time, I felt seen. My mom is a nurse. She works double shifts and still gets talked down to by people who think her accent means she's less smart. I've watched her cry quietly in our bathroom so no one hears. I didn't know we were allowed to speak up until I saw you do it. Thank you for showing me that it's not wrong to fight for what's right. I want to be a scientist too. I want to build something like you did. Marisol J." I read it twice. Then again, my hands trembled as I folded it back up. Of all the public reactions, the articles, the debates on television, this letter was the one that broke me open. Because this was why I did it. Not to win, not to ruin reputations, but so a 17-year-old girl could dream without shame. So someone like my younger self, cornered in a hospital supply closet, doubting her own worth, could know there's power in her voice. I sat quietly on the balcony, sunlight warm on my arms, Marisol's letter resting on my lap. The world felt different now. Not healed, but beginning to shift. Some fights aren't about revenge. They're about reclaiming the story, speaking it out loud so no one else feels alone inside it. And that's what I've learned. We don't always get to rewrite the past, but we do get to decide what happens next. And maybe, just maybe, someone's listening. So if this story meant something to you, share it, like it, subscribe, leave a comment, tell me what you reclaimed. Let's keep this ripple moving forward, because somewhere, another 17-year-old is watching.